Welcome to Radiant Midweek. Here we go. Welcome back to Radiant Midweek. You know, when I started Daniel chapter 9, I thought it'd be 2, maybe 3 podcasts, but here we are for number 5. I'm hoping we get to wrap this up today, even if we run a little bit longer than usual. Thanks for your patience. But a quick reminder, we're not in a hurry in our discovery of what the Bible has to say about the end times and what that means for us. However, I hope you're enjoying learning and understanding these building blocks so that we can have future conversations and understand how the authors looked back at Scripture, what their perspective of, and what the foundations of understanding Jesus referring to Daniel in Matthew 24, the book of Revelation references it several times. What are these symbols and why are they so important to our understanding of the end times conversation? Now, before we get into there, though, something that kind of happened in the last week or so that I thought was pretty interesting. When Jesus ascended into heaven to go back to the Father, it's interesting what the disciples were told. We see that in Acts chapter 1, verse 10. It says, the disciples, were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back the very same way you have seen him go into heaven. Here's why it's interesting. It's because I was sitting with a group and they were talking about hope. What is the message of hope in Scripture, in particular the New Testament? And some said, of course, it's forgiveness, which is amazing. Another said new life, absolutely. Several brought up the promise of going to heaven when we die. One mentioned life to the full. Another couple mentioned how Jesus helped fix their marriage. Another got them off drugs and helped them through their cancer battle. All great answers, and we need hope, particularly in some of those more difficult times of life. But I threw this out there in the conversation. I said, what about the hope that Jesus is coming back and establishing his kingdom on earth? To my surprise, first it was just silence, almost crickets in the room, that awkward silence you sometimes get. And then a few looked completely confused by that question. A couple others looked at me like I was a weirdo, or they were completely annoyed by it. And I began to ask, is this really something Christians hope for? It left me wondering, what's going on? Why doesn't the church talk about the second coming as much as they should and the hope that it brings? Why don't we talk more about Jesus' eventual kingdom? And yet, the first thing these 2 men in robes told the disciples, he's coming back. We're supposed to get excited. We're supposed to look forward to it. Jesus is going to establish his rule and reign on earth. Aren't you excited about that? But if we're being honest, many Christians aren't. And listen, no condemnation, no judgment here, just honest dialogue. Most of them are interested in getting the heck out of here. For a lot of Christians, they just want fire insurance and they want to know how Jesus is going to make their life here on earth better. In many ways, that's what I call the American gospel, and it's left us short-sighted and focused primarily on ourselves. And yet, there's some things you might be interested to know. First, the New Testament contains over 318 passages about the second coming of Jesus Christ. The entire Bible contains approximately 1,800 passages about the second coming. References to the second coming outnumber references to the first coming by a ratio of 8-1. It is mentioned in 40 of the 66 books of the Bible. 7 out of 10 chapters in the New Testament mention the second coming. And if you're counting, that's 1 out of every 30 verses. For the early church, the fact that Jesus was coming back again to rule and reign was at the center of everything they believed. They longed for the return of their king. And so let me ask you, how about you? Do you long for the rule and reign of Jesus as king? Why aren't we talking about it more? If the biblical authors talked about it so much, how come it has been neglected in today's modern church? Because remember, when the early disciples met each other and they greeted one another, they would often say, Maranatha. It simply means, come, Lord Jesus. They longed for Jesus to come back and rule and reign. How about you? Well, we're going to jump into the future today and look at continuing passages in Daniel chapter 9. And so let's dive right in. We got a lot of ground to cover today. In Daniel 9, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. And so as we often do, let's just take this one bite at a time, one piece at a time, and see what we can discover is being told to Daniel by Gabriel. The first question is probably fairly obvious. Who is the he that the verse starts off with? Now, there's a lot of opinions on this. Some believe that he in this verse is referring to the prince to come. That's in the previous verse. And to be honest with you, that's good scholarship. That's a good way to read the Bible. If you don't know what something means, go back to the last person mentioned, look at the verses that you are in, read it as a full passage to discover the answer. Let the Bible interpret the Bible. But unfortunately, we have to ask the question, does that apply here? Because it doesn't always in every case. And it doesn't fit with what we know of history. Now, the first argument, and this is from many of my friends that would have the preterist viewpoint, is that the prince who is to come, or the he in this verse, is Titus. And remember, Titus is the Roman, he would eventually be emperor. At the time, he was not, he was a general. His father was the emperor. He would conquer Jerusalem and destroy the temple. However, what we see from this verse doesn't fit with history. For instance, Titus did not confirm a covenant or a sign of a 7-year peace treaty. He did not purposefully end the sacrifice in the temple. There was no abomination that caused desolation with Titus. Did he enter the Holy of Holies? Did he enter the temple compound when it was on fire outside? He did, but that wasn't technically the definition of an abomination that causes desolation. There was no pagan sacrifice, no statues erected in the temple, no pig on the altar or pig's blood splattered around the courtyard. Titus did not demand worship of himself. In fact, something you probably should know, we've mentioned before, the soldiers tore down the temple against his will. Now, we've looked at Josephus before, but I want us to see what he has to say so that we understand why these two things don't fit, that Titus probably isn't what this is talking about. And so from Josephus, in his book of the war, he said this: when Titus perceived that his endeavors to spare a foreign temple turned to the damage of his soldiers and then be killed, he gave order to set the gates on fire, not the temple, the gates. On the next day, Titus commanded part of his army to quench that fire. Titus proposed to these that they should give him their advice on what should be done about the holy house. Now, some of these thought it would be best way to act according to the rules of war. In other words, demolish it. Others of them were of the opinion that in case the Jews would leave it, and none of them would lay their arms up in it, he might save it. But Titus said that although the Jews should get upon the holy house and fight us thence, yet ought we not to revenge ourselves on things that are inanimate, instead of the men themselves, and that he was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because this would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. So he commanded that the chosen men that were taken out of the cohorts should make their way through the ruins and quench the fire. In other words, to summarize, Titus didn't want the temple destroyed. It was an ornament. It was a symbol of the greatness of Rome, and they wanted to keep it. Remember, their intent was to continue getting tax revenue from Jerusalem, and they used things like the temple and great monuments to show the awesomeness of the empire of Rome. So he didn't initially want it to be burned down and destroyed. The second argument of the prince who is to come is that it's a future ruler. That the he in this verse is a brand new person, completely new thought, entirely separate from the verse before. And we have to remember that the Bible can skip hundreds of years in just one verse. It doesn't seem to care necessarily about giving us a timeline. And it could be that the angel is on to a new thought, possibly looking hundreds, if not thousands of years into the future. He is another future ruler. This is a completely separate story from AD 70, and it represents a new thought. Now, is there any way for us to know for sure? No. All we have at the moment is the evidence from history. Titus didn't do the things that are in this verse. However, the prevailing theory out there in many denominations and throughout what I would call the evangelical Christian world, by far what we hear the most is that he is a future Roman leader. And this is a very popular idea in eschatology circles and has been for quite some time, that there is a future revived Roman Empire. They get this from the statues in Daniel chapter 7 and the dreams Daniel had of 4 empires. And then from that revived empire comes an antichrist. And so from their sense, the logic says, go back to verse 25 and 26. They're tied in to this one. But let's read verse 26 again. It says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. So who is the he in this verse? He does equal Titus, since he was the ruler who came to destroy the city. What do we know? Titus was Roman. Therefore, the people of Titus must have been Roman. However, we're going to challenge that in a minute. The he in verse 27 then is a future ruler. It's not Titus, but it must be a Roman. Therefore, that person is Roman. And it must mean that the Antichrist will come from Rome. He will rule a future Roman Empire. Therefore, there must be a revival at some point of a Roman Empire. And down further the rabbit trail we go. Now, if we lean towards this Roman Empire theory, and can I please reiterate, since this is the prevailing theory out there, that it's only a theory. Oftentimes people talk about it like it's set in stone, and so please at least let me crack that nut for you. It is not set in stone. We don't know for sure that's what's going to happen. It is only a theory. It's still not 100% clear, and frankly, I have some pushback at this theory, if you're willing to hear it. For instance, we must ask if this is referring back to verse 26, who are the people of the ruler who will come? And of course, as we've said, a quick and obvious answer is, well, they're Romans, Jason. If it's a Roman ruler, these must be Romans, right? And of course, Vespasian and Titus are both Roman. Israel was under Roman rule. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem. There's really no arguing this. However, there is some debate out there about this as well. Were the people that Titus used to destroy Jerusalem and the temple, were they Roman? Or were they locals used by Roman leadership? In other words, mercenaries. Now remember, the siege of Jerusalem was carefully recorded by Josephus. Josephus was an eyewitness and wrote daily about the fall of Jerusalem. He wrote it to amazing detail. And so these well-documented chronologies of the war, according to Josephus, are available to us today about the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. We know what happened. Now, what he would tell us is this: the composition of the Roman legions were drawn from the surrounding countries around Israel. The Jerusalem battle was conducted by four main Roman legions: the 5th, the 10th, the 12th, and the 15th. What we learned, as you see on this chart, is that the 5th had soldiers from Judea, Syria, and Moasia. The 10th had mainly soldiers from Syria. It's important to note that Syria was a large land area or region, not necessarily the country that we know today, although it's situated where it was, but it was a much larger area than the country of today. The 12th Legion, the soldiers were from eastern Turkey and, again, Syria. The 15th, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. This was the composition of soldiers and the auxiliaries that were drawn from, and it was primarily from the surrounding countries of Israel. In particular, did you notice Syria came up several times? Another author, Nigel Pollard, who is not only a theologian, but he was a teacher at a college, he had this to say. He said that when you examine in great detail, and especially the ethnicity of the Roman soldiers of the eastern provinces during the first century, the overwhelming majority of the soldiers that destroyed the temple were primarily Syrians. These were Arabs and Eastern peoples. And he confirms that the vast majority of the soldiers that attacked Jerusalem under Titus were Middle Eastern peoples and not Europeans. In fact, the ratio was at least 11-1, that there were at least 11 Eastern or Middle Eastern soldiers for every Western soldier. So when we talk about the people that destroyed the city and the temple, we could be talking about the neighboring areas around Israel, not Europeans. These are the modern countries of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. And what do we know about these countries today? They are primarily Muslim, and Islam is their religion. And so what does this mean if you hold to the theory that this is referring to verse 26 and it's part of the Roman Empire? Well, then the people of the ruler who will come in verse 26, these are future Middle Eastern people or in that region of the world. Maybe there is a revitalized Roman Empire. We don't know. But what we know from history is they were hired soldiers from the surrounding countries that would later be transformed by Muhammad and Islam. They represent the former Muslim caliphate and empire, which we're going to talk more and more about. And so these are the two primary debates out there. And kind of when you hold to the Roman Empire theory, you have to ask then, who were the people? Were they Romans, meaning Europeans, or is it referring to the soldiers who were more locally sourced, which would be Middle Eastern? I'll let you decide which way you fall. I would encourage us to have a healthy skepticism. It may be true, but I would hope we'd never lock in so much that we might miss what's actually going on around us. Because I'd love to say that I'm absolutely certain, but I'm not. In fact, let me give you a bit of a glass of cold water here. For those who would say the correct way to interpret verse 27 is to go back to verse 26, well, let's go a step further. Let's truly apply a hermeneutic process here. The only reason we believe that in verse 26 and that it's referring to the Romans is because it already happened. We have the luxury of looking back to history and saying, well, we know what they didn't know back then, but because of what we've seen in history, this must be referring to the Romans. Christ was indeed rejected. 40 years later, the Romans showed up and destroyed Jerusalem. We know this, therefore, that's what the verse must mean. However, is that the best way to approach Bible study? Because let me show you something a little different. And imagine with me, it's a pretend exercise for a moment. Let's say I was looking at this before Jesus was born. And much like us today, I'm looking at this prophecy concerning the future. But I have no context at the moment. At this point, let's say it was like 10 BC. There has been no Jesus. Jerusalem still exists as a city. So I don't have any of the historical data to distort or color my lens. How then, maybe in 10 BC, might I look at these verses? Let me read them again to you. In verse 25, it says, "So you are to know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince," and I stop right there. Who is the Prince? In this verse, it's very clear. The Messiah is the Prince. So until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, so 69 weeks total. It will be built again. What is it? Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be built again with streets and a moat, and it will be in times of a distress. Then, after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So let me stop right there. The people of the prince who is to come. Now, again, I don't have the luxury of history already unfolding. So how would I naturally read this verse when I say, okay, so there's a people and they're of the prince who is to come? Well, who's the prince? At this point, if I go back to the previous verse, the only prince mentioned at the moment is the Messiah. So a good reading of this, if I were in 10 BC, is it's absolutely applicable for me to say the people of the Messiah who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he, well, who's the he here? Well, we just need to go back to the previous 2 verses, right? The only he we've talked about at this point is Messiah the Prince. And he, the Messiah, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he, the Messiah, will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come the one who makes desolate, until there is a complete destruction. One that is decreed gushes forth on the one who makes desolate. Again, I'm not saying that's what it means. I'm just saying if we use a proper method of biblical interpretation, that's how we could read it, being that if we were reading this in, let's say, 10 BC, we haven't seen Jesus be born. We haven't seen him killed. We haven't seen the destruction of Jerusalem. And we look at prince in these 2 verses. It's nagid. It's the same word both times. So it would be absolutely reasonable to come to the conclusion that the Prince of Israel is the Messiah and leader of this Jewish nation. We would have no other concept of he. It would be obvious to me to look at the previous verses. And so he must be Messiah the Prince. He confirms a covenant for a week. He stops the sacrifice midweek. He will set up an abomination that causes desolation. See how tricky this can be if we don't stop and really give it some thought. See, the only reason we know that the people in verse 26 is the Roman army is from history. We would have never known that ahead of time. It's completely separate thought from verse 25 when it talks about the prince who is to come is different from Messiah, the prince. Did you catch that? And this is why it can be confusing, and we cannot be completely dogmatic about it. Because if the prince in verse 26 can be different than the prince in verse 25, I'm telling you this, the he in verse 27 can be a different person than the prince in verse 26. And I know this can be confusing because prophecy can be hard. This is why we have to be careful about being dogmatic. Eventually someone will ask, Jason, then what is your opinion on this? And again, I'm just going to warn you, it doesn't necessarily represent much of the mainstream consensus. But I think we have to consider a couple things. I opt for a common sense reading of the scripture, and I will keep in mind what I just showed you, also my understanding of history. Verse 26 refers to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. The people of the prince who is to come are either the Roman army, or Romans in this case, or local mercenaries, largely Syrian. But in this verse, the prince is Titus. In verse 27, what I believe is this. I believe it is now a completely new thought, much like verse 26 was. These two verses are separate events. There is a new future he that has nothing to do with Titus. He will make a peace treaty for 7 years. The peace treaty will be broken midway through. And you say, can you give me an example, Jason, of this where it can be talking about somebody, then refer to a he in the next verse and they're not the same person? And I'll say, yes. In fact, we've already discussed it in chapter 11 of Daniel. We'll read that verse 36 again. It says the king. So in this case, I don't have time to go through all the passages there. We were talking about a king and the struggle between the north and the south. But suddenly it says the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. And then a series of verses through verse 45 will begin to describe who this king is and how he acted. And we have to ask, who is the king? Why? Because, of course, we'd be tempted to look prior at the other verses. And if we did that, it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a foreshadow of the upcoming antichrist. However, when we look at the verses 36 to 45 and our understanding of history, we realize that Antiochus never did any of these things. History has taught us then that this is future. And so we see just in one verse, without going into much detail, it moves from one king to the next king and doesn't give any thought to explaining it. This is why when we're reading prophecy, it can be difficult and we have to keep somewhat of an open mind to options as long as we stay true to the biblical narrative. Therefore, I believe the he in verse 27 is an entirely new person, just like in verse 26. While maybe there's a future Roman Empire revival, I do not believe this passage guarantees it. And our insistence that it does, I believe, colors and distorts our interpretation of the end times conversation. If you've ever watched a magician, they'll keep you busy, of course, looking at their left hand while they're hiding something or moving something in their right hand. And the same is true here. We can be so focused on one interpretation only of the scripture, and we can dig in and insist that only this could be true, that we may actually fail to see the actual events occurring and how they may be a little bit different from our paradigm. And these are the biases that we talked about in a previous podcast, and we need to be careful. And so with that in mind, let's dive into verse 27 again. In verse 27, it says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. And in the middle of the 7, he put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. And so as I talked about, the he that will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, I believe that he is a new person. Now, when it says confirm a covenant, it's a peace treaty. The first two words literally are shall cause a covenant to be strong. And the root words are to prevail, to have strength, stability, make firm. The wording implies that the Jews are forced into this agreement. Daniel does not use the traditional words that mean to cut a treaty for a covenant, which was standard in describing godly covenants. This one is different. It is a contract. It will be for 1 7. And so here's that final 70th week. Remember, up to this point, we've had 69 weeks. This is that final 70th week of prophecy we've been discussing. Up to this point, we've only experienced the 69. This is the 70th. In the middle of this 7-year period that started with a peace treaty, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. So this is somewhere around the 3.5-year mark, or 42 months. We've seen this number come up several times. He will impose his will on the temple. We'll see this again, by the way, in Revelation chapter 13, verse 5. It says, the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. Then it says, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. I've said this several times, but just to make sure this gets through our heads, for this to happen, it means there will have to be a temple or a tabernacle that has returned back to the daily sacrifice in Jerusalem. And the other various offerings have to start as well. In order for him to stop it, there needs to be a temple and there needs to be sacrifices going on. What exactly will it be? Well, we're not sure. And what will this person look like? Not clear. Antiochus IV is referenced by Jesus as an example for us to look back at. However, Daniel does mention this abomination that causes desolation twice. First one here is in chapter 9. The other is in Daniel chapter 12. It says in verse 11, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Jesus mentions this. In Matthew 24, verse 15, it says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, he'll then say, basically, run for your life. Paul talks about it, interestingly enough. In 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, he says, he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And then John shows us in his vision in Revelation chapter 13, starting in verse 14, because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It's talking about the false prophet here, by the way. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, that's the antichrist, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. If you haven't figured it out yet, this abomination of desolation, the stopping of sacrifices, some kind of statue or image placed in the temple, all of these things are a major, major sign of the end of times that we should be looking for. The Bible speaks of it on several occasions. Then that verse, it says, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Well, this end times person is still on God's timeline and God is still in control. However, no spoilers here. We'll talk more about how the story ends as we dive into Revelation, even Matthew 24. But let's try to land the plane and conclude here, if we can. As we start moving into the future, we begin tackling difficult subject matter, and we have to tread cautiously. The idea that the future Antichrist leader is from the revived Roman Empire is firmly rooted into the American eschatological conversation, particularly amongst evangelicals. It's almost taught as if it's a duh and it's going to happen. And any pushback sometimes receives a swift rebuttal from the guardians of this idea. And I'm not here saying it isn't true. It quite possibly be. And if you're firmly rooted in that, then great. But what I am saying is, can we at least keep an open mind that maybe there's at least one other option, and we need to pay attention to it so that we're aware of both? Any dreams of the revival of the Roman Empire are still alive and well in Europe. So it could happen. I mean, has there ever been anybody in the last couple hundred years or so that has marched into Rome and declared themselves to be the Roman emperor? And oh boy, has there. And many of you have probably heard this person's name. Napoleon did that. We also see that Mussolini, right before World War II, he had dreams to recreate the Roman Empire in order to decrease Italy's importance in the world. So there still are seeds throughout that region of the world of reviving the Roman Empire. We can't ignore this theory. It's quite a possibility. However, was there another empire after Rome that was just as big and powerful? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, our Western textbooks don't always study it, but this empire would even eventually conquer Rome in Constantinople. We have to remember that Rome, much like the legs of the statue that Daniel would show, it was two regions. There was a Western Roman Empire, there was an Eastern Roman Empire. Even after the Western Empire fell, the Eastern Empire would go on to exist for another 1,000 years after that. So yes, There was, however, another empire post-Rome that would eventually even conquer Rome. It would bring a prophet. It would describe a different God. It too would rule with iron teeth. This religion desires at its core to fill the earth with its righteousness and its laws, and it teaches that it should do so by force. In fact, it is rewarded if you do. And so we have to pay attention that there is another possibility. Jesus hints at a future ruler. Paul warns us about it, and Revelation details it. That there would be a future empire that would arise. It would have a Messiah. It would have a prophet. It would persecute, in this case, however, the uniqueness of this future empire will persecute both Israel, the Jews, and Christians. Daniel would say it was a time like never, ever before. And so I ask us just to consider, as we look into the world we live in today, does that sound like a revived European Roman Empire, one that would want to eradicate Christians and the Jews? Do you really see Rome killing off Christians en masse? Or is there another religion out there that doesn't like either group? It teaches they are infidels and seeks to destroy both. And so I ask this before we head off into our next podcast. What happens when you're so busy focusing on Europe, you completely miss the Middle East? I'll see you next week. We're going to be diving a little more into this subject for a few weeks and discovering another worldview, another group of people out there who we need to pay attention to that have their own end-time story and are moving their chess pieces in life towards it. I believe it's important, and I think you know who they are. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit like or comment or forward this on to a friend. It helps us get the word out there to a bigger audience. Thanks so much for listening.